if they're late. Let me begin. Do you hear me, everyone?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Very much.
So welcome, everyone. Welcome from Russia. It's great to see you, so many people attending this online lecture. My name is Alexander Lukin. I'm the head of the Department of International Relations and the International Laboratory of World Order Studies and the New Regionalism at the High School of Economics in Moscow. I also head the Center of East Asian and Shanghai Cooperation Organization Studies at Moscow State Institute of International Relations and work as chair professor at the School of Public Affairs at Zhejiang University in China. We are now living in difficult times, I guess, in every country, or in most countries in the world. But the humankind in general, and particularly us Russians, are very adaptable. So we decided, as we usually do, to use these difficult circumstances to our advantage. The advantage of having an online seminar, besides the very fact that you don't have to leave your house and drive somewhere far, suffering from traffic, is that you can have a larger and a more international audience. So to make our life more exciting, while we are locked in our houses, we decided to launch this new seminar. We wanted to call it first Stay-at-Home Seminar. But since we still have some lingering hope that we will be allowed to go out at some point at least, and may want to continue this seminar, we finally decided to call it the Eurasian Online Seminar. Our idea is to host outstanding speakers on a multitude of issues in international relations, world economy, area and Asian studies in particular, from various countries with some connection to the concept of Greater Eurasia, which is a huge continent, the geopolitical importance of which is growing fast. Today is our first session, and our first speaker is the most outstanding among all the outstanding people that I know. The patriarch of East Asian Studies, Professor Ezra Vogel from Harvard University, and we are very proud to have him. Most people know him well without any introduction, but I'll still say a few words anyway. So Professor Vogel is the Henry Ford's the second professor of the social sciences emeritus at Harvard University. He was born in 1930 in Delaware, Ohio. Professor Vogel succeeded John Fairbank to become the second director of Harvard East Asian Research Center in 1972, and as chairman of the Council of East Asian Studies in 1977. He was director of the program on US-Japan relations at the Center for International Relations, and since 1987, honorary director. He was director of the Fairbanks Center from 95 to 99, and the first director of the Asia Center from 97 to 99. He taught courses on Communist Chinese society, Japanese society, and industrial East Asia. The Japanese edition of his book, Japan as Number One, Lessons for America, which was published in '79. And I saw it when I was at school in my father's study, actually, and read it at that time, remains the all-time bestseller in Japan of non-fiction by a Western author. He officially retired in 2000, but takes part in research and East Asia-related activities. He wrote dozens of books, but his most recent and most influential books that I should mention include Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China, the best biography of Deng Xiaoping and the description of his times, and China and Japan Facing History, another book, the most recent book, and he is going to speak on it now. Today, Professor Vogel is going to speak on Sino-Japanese relations and the US attitudes towards these two countries. The talk turned out to be very well attended, which is understandable. We have more than 100 people registered. Most of them are Russians, the majority being the faculty members and students of our university, but we also have some people from China, India, Japan, South Africa, the United States, and probably other countries. Last thing I wanted to mention is that this seminar is going to be held on a regular basis online for the time being, which gives many of us the advantage to join in at any point from anywhere. Some top-level experts have already agreed to speak. After Professor Vogel, I mean not today, but maybe next week or in a week. Please keep an eye on our announcements, either on the website of the laboratory or in your mailbox. We are going to upload the video of the seminars onto our website. Those of you who are willing to participate in the discussion after the talk, please do so in a concise manner, since there are many of us participating, and instead of raising your hand, as you usually do under normal circumstances, please write your full name with the tag question in the chat window to our right. Thanks a lot. So Professor Vogel, please feel free to speak for as long as you wish on whatever topic you choose. And after you finish, we are going to ask you as many questions as you would like to answer. And now, Professor Vogel, the floor is yours. Hello.
I think the organizer can turn on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, sure. We can hear you.
You can hear me now.
Yes, yes. Everyone can hear.
It's my great privilege to take part in this. This is the first time I've spoken to an international audience through Zoom. And in these very difficult times of coronavirus, I think we academics around the world should use this opportunity fully to engage in such intellectual discussions, and I'm greatly privileged. I'm privileged to have it with my friend Alex Lukin. The first time I visited the Soviet Union was in 1980. I took part in a conference organized by Scalapino on the American side, and the guy named, we call him Gene Primakov, on the Russian side. And at that conference, I met a couple young scholars on Russia. One was named Ladyshev, and the other was named Petrov. And I also met a very promising young China scholar at that time. I thought of him as a China scholar, although he was much broader, named Vladimir Lukin. And I was very impressed that this was a very wise, open-minded, and very promising young person in his early 30s. And it's been my privilege to know him. So when his son Alexander came to Harvard for a year, it was a great privilege to have him and to become his friend and to carry on exchanges. My own educational background, as you can tell from the wonderful excessive praise from my friend Alexander Lukin, is I was a sociologist who worked on China and Japan on the domestic society. But when I retired at Harvard in 2000, a grandson said, I think my grandpa is leaving his job, but not his work. And I think that was a very good description. So I decided to work very hard to try to introduce the American audience to what was going on in China. And I thought the most significant thing about China at that time was what Deng Xiaoping had done under Reform and Opening. And so I spent 10 years working on that book about, I had a very good fortune as a Harvard professor of having many good Chinese students and of also having the opportunity to meet a lot of Chinese leaders. And I used all the opportunities I had as fully as I could to get interviews to try to understand the insights, and it took me 10 years to write that book. In 2010, when I finished that book, I was trying to decide what I want to do next with my life, and I decided that I want to write about China and Japan. Until that time, I had studied the society of China, the study of Japan. I had an opportunity to know many Japanese leaders and Chinese leaders, and it was really at the very worst time in Chinese and Japanese relations. And I still had the, maybe it's the illusion that maybe we scholars might have some influence in the world. And I felt I was in an unusual situation since I had written a bestseller about Japan in Japan and a bestseller about China in China. That I might possibly have some influence. And I really wanted those countries to get together. My basic stance around the world is that I think the world is now too small and we need all the cooperation we can get. We need the cooperation between Russia and the United States. We need the cooperation between China and the United States. We need between China and Japan. And I felt that my contribution might be in terms of writing objective history of the Chinese and the Japanese relations. I was not a historian by training, but I spent about 8 years studying the history of China and Japan relations. I don't read classical Chinese, I don't read classical Japanese. I have to operate in the modern languages, but I read the work of scholars who had worked on these earlier periods. And so for about 8 years, I worked to try to understand the broad history of the relations between China and Japan. The reason I chose to work on history is because the Chinese had been saying that the real problem in relations with Japan was that the Japanese don't understand history. And I felt that if the Chinese wrote a book, the Japanese would be suspicious. And if the Japanese wrote a book, the Chinese would be suspicious. And perhaps someone who really believes in both countries and wants to see China succeed and wants to see Japan succeed and had many friends and was able to stand in possibly a somewhat more objective outside position, there might be a possibility that I could have some influence. And the Chinese have an expression, 旁察者清, which means the person who stands aside sometimes can see things more clearly, and that was my aim. So I spent 8 years. Now, since the group I'm talking to in Moscow today is interested in the more contemporary field, I thought I would start with the period after World War II. This is the period that I grew up in, and I thought I would trace the history of the relation between China and Japan since 1945, because in trying to think about the longer term perspective, which is the responsibility of us old people, who try to provide a broader perspective from our experience, I would try to give a broader picture of the relations and then give my thoughts about how the relationship is going. In 1945, after the Japanese lost the war, they wanted very much to continue relations with China. In the 1930s, part of the rationale that they used for why they needed to be in Manchuria and the northeast of China was that they didn't have enough food, that Japan was so small, they had a big population, they needed more space. And after World War II, they had so little space, and so much of their economy even during the wartime, depended on the relations with China. A lot of the highest industrial production was in China's northeast under Japanese hands, and they wanted to continue trade with China and pick it up after World War II. But at that time, the United States government, which dominated the occupation of Japan, did not want Japan to have too close relations with China. And so we made it very difficult. So within Japan at that time, there were the dominant parties of Liberal Democratic Party, which came together in 1955, but had roots immediately after the war. This party was, of course, very oriented to the United States ambitions around the world and in Europe. And they did not have much relation with China. But a group of opposition people still kept up some relations with China. Some of them were in the socialist and the communist parties in Japan. And even within the Democratic Party, there were some people who had connections with China before World War II who wanted to keep up connections. So there were threads of connections that came through Japanese leftist eyes. And therefore, the relation with China was very little economic exchange, but visitors. And on the Chinese side, for example, there was Liao Chengzhi. Liao Chengzhi was a very unusual person because his father, Liao Zhongkai, had been a potential successor to Sun Yat-sen and was killed, but had spent some time in Japan when Liao Chengzhi was a boy. So Liao Chengzhi went to a privileged Japanese school, spoke Japanese like a native, had many Japanese friends, and because of his important position, he was on the Politburo. So he was the only person since World War II who's been on the Chinese Politburo who had an instinctive native understanding of Japan. And therefore, in the entire period until he died in the late 80s, he was the main person on the Chinese side who saw the Japanese. So in short, during this early period, there were a very small number of Japanese leftists and Liao Chengzhi and a few other Chinese who had known the Japanese from before the war, who saw each other, and relations were so minimal, a very tiny bit of trade. Then the second period I described, and this, what I'm talking about today, is basically to give you the essence of the main ideas of the book that I wrote on China and Japan. So the second period I described started around 1972, and I trace it up to 1993. This is my own way of periodization. There could be others, but that's the one I've chosen. Because the United States was so tough on Japan and did not allow them to have relations with China, the Japanese were not very happy, but the American position was so dominant that they accepted that. But then suddenly, when Henry Kissinger went to China in '71, then the Japanese were extremely upset because we had asked the Japanese to cooperate with us in blocking China from joining the United Nations. We had asked the Japanese to have no contact, and then we had assured them that if there were going to be contact, we'd be in touch with them. And the United States did not follow through on that when Kissinger visited in '71 and Nixon visited in '72. So the relationship between the Japanese Prime Minister Sato Eisaku and Nixon was very bad. And it had to do with Nixon's concern about being elected and needing the support of Southern textile industry and being very concerned with Japanese imports. So that the relationship between Sato and Nixon was bad. But suddenly, when the United States formed relations with China, Japan tried to move very quickly. And although Sato had terrible relations with China, the Japanese felt they needed to get a new prime minister who could develop better relations and form contacts. So within several months, they elected a new prime minister, Tanaka Kakue. And Tanaka, one of the first things he did was arrange to go to China, and he was there. And then he moved even more quickly than the United States to have formal relations with China. So in 1972, already China and Japan had formal relations. But he moved so quickly that all the usual things like where the consulate's located, how do you set up the exchange programs, what is the basic underlying rules for exchange of economic goods, all these questions were left in abeyance and were not really solved. And even therefore, Japan and China officially had relations. And during this time from 1972, many Chinese accepted Japanese visitors. So many Japanese business people had the idea that if they stretched out their hands and were somewhat helpful to China, they might establish a basis for broader business. And many Japanese still had sentimental feelings about Chinese culture and were aware of the horrible things they had done in China in World War II and wanted to establish relations. So during this period of 72 up to 78, they had many contacts. Now, Deng Xiaoping was out because of the Cultural Revolution, but when Zhou Enlai developed cancer in 1973, he brought with him Deng Xiaoping to meet many foreign leaders. So from 73 to 75, there were just enormous number of foreign visitors that Deng Xiaoping met. And by far the largest number were Japanese. And Japanese groups of all kinds went to China, and Deng Xiaoping was their host from this period from 1973 up until 76 when Zhou Enlai died, and Mao Zedong again put Deng in a holding position outside the realms of power. So Deng Xiaoping was in a very good position because of his welcoming to I counted once over 40 Japanese groups from business, from religious groups, from locality groups, from visited Deng, and he had gotten to know them. But relationships did not develop, but there were the personal basis of relations between the small groups of Japanese who started visiting. Then when Deng began to come to power, even before the third plenum in December 1978, Deng decided that he needed to have closer relations to Japan. And he, I think, was already aware at that time that he would play a major role in the reform and opening policies, and that Japan and the United States were the two most important countries to try to develop support from, because the Japanese had not given reparations for World War II, and therefore they might be very helpful in providing technology and economic assistance. And the Japanese were willing to do that, I think, partly because of guilt for the horrible things that they did in World War II, and many felt they had done terrible things. And also because the business people thought this was a way of establishing a basic improved relationship so that they could have better economic relations. So when the thing that was blocking the development of broader relations in the mid-70s was that there was no treaty on peace and friendship which dealt with the issues of consulates and reparations and all kinds of those delicate issues that need to be dealt with. So as soon as Deng in early 78 could see he was coming to power, he immediately worked on solving this problem, and in the summer set up the Treaty for Peace and Friendship, which laid the basis for broader contacts even before the the third plenum in December 1978 when he was ready to become the leading person in guiding reform and opening. And before he took power, he visited Southeast Asia and Japan. And he also, in January, immediately after the third plenum, he visited the United States. And so when they formalized a relationship. So he already was thinking in terms of reform and opening that Japan was going to play a very large role. And when he visited Japan in December 1978, he visited several factories. One factory he visited was Kimitsu, which was at that time probably the most modern steel plant in the world, making almost 10 million tons of steel a year. The Kimitsu steel plant became the basis for the Chinese steel plant Baoshan. It became the model, and many engineers from that steel plant visited Shanghai to help establish the very first steel plant. As you know now, China makes about 1 million tons of steel a year. In the time of the Great Leap Forward, they were down to making about 13 million tons. And it wasn't much higher, and maybe less than 30 million tons. And the whole country was being produced in China in 1978. So that could, the Japanese steel plant could be a very solid base for the development of the steel industry. He also wanted to visit a modern factory for producing automobiles. And at that time, he visited Nissan. Nissan has a very interesting connection with China because in the Manchuria, Ni stands for Nihon, for Japanese steel. And it was the steel plant in Manchuria, not a steel plant, but it was made various kind of products in Manchuria. And so when they developed in Japan after 1945, it went into automobiles. And at that time, it was one of the few automobile plants in the world that had robots. So he was laying the basis for Japanese industrial relations to assist even before the third plenum. He also rode on Shinkansen, the high-speed rail. As you know now, China has something close to half the high-speed rail mileage in the entire world. But at that time, of course, they had none. So the first Chinese leader to ride on a high-speed rail was Deng Xiaoping in October 1978 when he visited Japan. He also visited Osaka to see Matsushita. Matsushita, which makes electronics and under the national brand and various other brand names, was making television sets. At that time, of course, they didn't yet have computers, but Deng realized that in electronics, calculating machines, and television sets, it was very important to move. And so he called Matsushita the god of enterprise. And they had a wonderful session. Matsushita had been in China in the 1930s. He grew up as a very poor boy and started making bicycle lanterns, bicycle lights. And he gradually moved up from there. Was one who took a very small industry and built it up to a very modern international company. So in these visits, Deng laid the basis for the business economic relations that he would have that would develop after 1978 when they began the program of reform and opening. And the Japanese
Professor, you've turned your microphone off. And again off. And once again, please. That's right.
How's it okay? Is there anything I should repeat now?
No, that's fine. That's
Okay, I'll just continue then. So I'm sorry, it was completely by accident. Then when he was at his height in the 1980s, the Japanese were quite generous, and the Japanese companies have a long-term perspective. So unlike American companies, which are more likely to want to make immediate profits to show to their stockholders every 3 months, the Japanese are more concerned with long-term economic relations. So they were willing to teach some technology to get established and to be quite generous, even lose a little money in order to establish a basis for their companies to be there for a long time. So in sector after sector, Japanese in the 1980s were extraordinarily helpful. They gave more economic aid to China than any other country, and they gave an enormous amount of technology. Of course, the technology that the Chinese had been very contributed in the 1950s by Russia and Eastern Europe. And now, after 1978, they were going to have a new round of modernization in their technology sector and in their industry by learning from Japan. And I was working in Guangdong for a few months in the mid-80s. And I remember going into a factory which had a sign in Chinese, we are using modern Japanese management techniques. They knew that Japan had a reputation for having high quality control in industry, and so they were learning. So the basic relationship then during the 80s up until the early 90s was one of very good relation between China and Japan. One of the events that I think deserves more publicity, somehow people don't talk about it so much, is in 1992, the Japanese emperor visited China. That's the only time in history that a Japanese emperor has ever visited China. And no Chinese emperor had ever visited Japan. So it had an extraordinary historical significance. The reason the Chinese were eager to do that is after the Tiananmen incident in 1989, which was such a tragedy where so many people were shot near the Tiananmen Square, there had been many sanctions by Western countries against China. And the Chinese were very eager to get internationally known leaders to come to China. And so they thought that if the Japanese emperor came, that would help them break through some of the sanctions from Western countries so that they can open up closer relations. So in 1992, the emperor visited. Then what happened to Chinese-Japanese relations? My interpretation is that the key development had to do with the decision that Deng Xiaoping made after the 1989 Tiananmen incident, which was that they were very worried about what was happening to the youth of China. They had seen what happened in the Soviet Union with Gorbachev. Gorbachev had visited Beijing just before the Tiananmen incident in 1989. And they were very concerned that the same things might happen. And so Deng said, we need a patriotic education campaign. The patriotic education campaign was designed to instill patriotism and respect for the great country of China. But one part of the education campaign that was very successful was of arousing sentiments about the Japanese invasion in World War II. So the publicity about Japan in World War II became very strong during this period. I don't think that Deng intended originally to have the campaign primarily anti-Japanese, but in terms of sentiments of the Chinese people that would arouse patriotism, the anti-Japanese feelings were very strong and very powerful. So in this period of the early 90s then, they began to publicize the horrible things that Japan had done in World War II. Of course, the old people who remembered World War II hated the Japanese for all the crimes that they committed, and many of them had relatives and friends who were killed, and they had stories from their own experience or their friends' experience of what the Japanese had done. But the effect of the new kind of publicity in the 90s gave a new generation, after all, from 1945 to the 90s, was already over 40 years. So that many people, the adults, no longer remembered what the Japanese did. But the Chinese used modern techniques of propaganda. And of course, movies were very popular at that time in China. It was not quite yet, television was just coming in, and television and movies, but of World War II movies. And those of you who visited Beijing in the 1990s know how easy it was to find World War II movies where Japanese terrible guys. And of course, the anti-Japanese movies were not only a product of the government giving direction, but of companies that wanted to make money by selling anti-Japanese war movies were very popular. And also they were able to create little children's games where with their thumbs they could push various machines where young Chinese heroes would fight and beat up the Japanese warriors in World War II. So by using modern techniques, the anti-Japanese feelings after the mid-90s became very strong. Of course, from 1978, when Deng started reform and opening until the 90s, the Japanese had been extraordinarily generous and given a great deal. The Japanese were still giving some technology, and they had developed some joint ventures in China into the 1990s. But China was not so dependent on Japanese assistance because they had already learned a lot. And so they felt that they could afford to have a lot of anti-Japanese sentiments. And that helped provide the patriotism to support the regime after the Tiananmen incident. Then the next period I talk about from after 93 is the period when Japan and China relations were at the very worst. And this was a time when I was deciding to work about 2010 when I finished my book on Deng. And it was at that time that relations were so bad. And we know that they were peaked at two incidents. One incident was a Chinese ship bumped into a Japanese ship and then bumped into a second ship and caused damage. And the Japanese demanded that the commander of that ship be tried in a Japanese court, and China was furious. The second was a couple of years later, in 2012, when at that point, the Chinese were claiming that the Japanese had nationalized the Senkaku Islands. What had happened was that the Japanese private industry was selling the property to a Japanese, the Japanese government bought the property, which is not exactly the same as international of making it a government sovereignty claim. It was really the ownership of the land, but the Chinese became very upset. So they used those incidents to express their anger at Japan. And they referred heavily to World War II. And my own interpretation, having looked at the long historical relationship of the two countries, was that this had much deeper meaning than those two incidents. In 1895, when the Sino-Japanese War began, there's almost no Chinese who thought the Japanese could possibly win the war. It was a little pipsqueak country of islands off the coast that had learned culture from China. And China was so much bigger and stronger and grander that nobody thought that Japan could win. In 1895, when the Japanese won that war, in my view, that was even more shocking than the Opium War, the loss of to the British and French in the middle of the 19th century. That this little country, the amazing thing was that even though Japan defeated them, that they were willing to send so many people to Japan to study. And from this period of 1895 until World War II, if you say, where did the Chinese learn about the modern world? It was in Japan. Words like socialism and communism, where did Japan had shakai shugi, 社会主義 in Chinese. All these terms came from Japanese books because one of the Japanese Marxists, Kawakami Hajime, wrote about Marxism, communism, and the leftists in China learned about it through Japanese. Zhou Enlai studied there, Chiang Kai-shek studied there, Lu Xun studied there. In the early period, Sun Yat-sen, Liao Zhongkai, but also Liang Qichao and Kang Youwei, all of them had been in Japan. So in all sectors, it was not an organized government-led, China was not united enough to do that, but many middle-class Chinese families who saw their children having a future thought it could be in Japan. So from this period of 1895 until about 2005, 2008, the Japanese really had become the top relation between the two countries. If you say who was on top and who was on bottom, until 1895, for over 2,000 years, China had been on top. From 1895 until about 2008 or 10, Japan was on top. And now the relationship was changing and China was gaining the upper hand. And in 2008, two important events, of course. One was the Chinese Olympics, which were so successful that Chinese really gained a great deal of confidence they could have a bigger and grander Olympics than anybody else. Their economy had grown so much. And also the global financial crisis, where the Western countries and Japan were in so financial trouble. And then 2010, the World Bank said in that year, the estimates of the total size of the Chinese economy had passed that of Japan. So in this period from about 2008 to about 2012, at the very bottom edge of the relationship, when it was at the very worst, and in my perspective, if you look at it from history, this is a very important turning point. And China was, in a way, to use American slang expression, was sticking it to them. They were showing that they were the big boy on the block. They were the strong country, and Japan should begin to bow down. And I think that was the very essence of the Chinese attitude. I think more important than the particular incidents that led to the difficulties. And so by 2010, 2012, from Chinese point of view, it was clear that they were now on top, and Japan had to play the underdog and listen more to China. By about 2014, I think the dangers of collision on the Senkaku Diaoyudao were sufficiently severe, the Chinese decided to try to calm things down. And so they did. And so by the 2014, they began to try to calm things down. At the very peak, when the relationships were really bad, if you did a public opinion poll in China, about 90%, over 90% had really bad feelings about Japan. And about the same percentage of Japanese had bad attitudes. The relationships were really horrible. But a few years later, the Chinese attitudes toward Japan began to improve. Why were they beginning to improve? One reason was that a lot of Chinese were going to Japan as tourists, and the numbers went up very rapidly. We were expecting this year to have over 10 million Chinese tourists. Last year was over 8 million. A decade earlier was around 1 million. So the number of Chinese who went to Japan, and then they would say, huh, these people don't behave like the soldiers we see in the movies of World War II. They're rather polite, the society is orderly, it's clean, they're respectful, they're nice to the Chinese visitors. And so I think the impact of so many million Chinese visitors to Japan really had an impact on the point of view. I think another factor was that for the Chinese who wanted to unify the country by having an enemy, the Chinese now had a new rival that could begin with. They were strong enough that they could begin to challenge the United States. So that if you were a Chinese patriot trying to whip up enthusiasm against foreign countries, the United States now, and particularly with Trump, I think we emerged as a power that was easy to dislike by many foreign countries. And so I think the need, if you were a Chinese patriot unifying the country, to have an enemy like Japan was no longer quite so strong. So in my view, that also underlay the changing attitude toward Japan. And I think from the Japanese side, however, their public opinion toward China has not changed that much. The Chinese images have changed a great deal in the last few years, maybe 30% or so, now begin to have more positive feelings toward Japan. But the Japanese, looking at what the Chinese do to fly planes and send ships near Senkaku Gyayudao Islands, are still very upset. They don't trust the Chinese. They feel that if China is really into a period where they have trouble getting internal domestic peace, that it would be very attractive to Chinese leaders to attack Japan again as an enemy and stir up anti-Japanese feelings. And they don't feel the Chinese have been very generous to Japanese companies. At the same time, in the last year or so, there has been an attempt to improve relations, and from the Japanese point of view, is quite pragmatic. They feel business opportunities, and they have taken the long-term view and trying to make use of those business opportunities. And unfortunately, because of the coronavirus problem, the visit of Xi Jinping that was to have taken place this spring to Japan is not taking place. It was the first time in 8 years that top Chinese leader was to visit Japan. It was a real opportunity to improve relations. I think that will still happen. I think so if you ask me what the likely prospect is in the next few years, it's that China and Japan will begin to have more pragmatic relationship, that China will point their antagonism to the United States instead of to Japan, and that Japanese businesses will still continue to operate in China, that even though the efforts of some Japanese government officials is to try to decrease their dependence on China, many businesses find the opportunities of making parts in China still very good. And in the retailing sector, they also see service sector opportunities that would be likely to continue. So from the Japanese point of view, I think there's a willingness now to be quite pragmatic, but in the end, they do not have high trust in China's long-term motives, and therefore I think they will keep the United States security relations. Even though the United States is not as secure a partner as it was a few years ago, still they feel they have no choice but to rely. They cannot possibly produce the level of army expenditures, military expenditures that the United States and China can have. And therefore they want to keep relations. But I think they will also try to develop certain kind of technology to defend themselves in case the United States should not prove so reliable. So that's my very quick overview of China-Japan relations in the last period since World War II. And I welcome questions and comments. Thank you very much, Elodie.
Thank you very much, Professor Vogel. I think we have some people who would like to ask questions. The first is Dr. Sergei Trush. Are you here? Hello.
Yes, I am.
Yes, yes. Dr. Trush is a researcher from Institute of US and Canada Studies in Moscow, Russian Academy of Sciences. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Vogel, for your very thought-provoking and balanced presentation. And you are quite familiar to the Russian China watching community and China and Japan watching community here. Let me ask you the following question. Well, your professional career was focused on both countries, on Japan and China, and China watching is pretty important now in Russian policy now at this very moment due to objective reasons. We know that China watching has always been very tightly interlinked with practical policy. I mean, academic China watching as academic enterprise. Well, it's quite natural, and we know that to a certain extent, China watching was more related to practical policy, to foreign ideologies, and even foreign policy propaganda than analytic enterprise. We know the names like, and you know the name like Bill Gertz, Mike Pillsbury, such names as now Peter Navarro. From our point of view, those personalities were not so much interested in the real picture of China, but they do have their own political agendas, or sometimes even making big bucks on China watching. My question considers the academic field. Since you have been in the field for many years, there are still core questions concerning contemporary China, like what is the origin of Chinese political regime? What is the main characteristics of its economic model? What is the stability, to what extent the Chinese society is stable, and to what extent the effectiveness of political control is taking place. My question is, what are the main ideas, lines of divide inside the China watching academic community? Maybe what are the most prominent books recently? What is your perspective on that? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I'm afraid I cannot give a short answer. I'm a professor still. It's a very long, let me give a little lengthy explanation. After World War II, there was a recognition that the United States is a global power, and we need to develop some basic understanding around the world. And our government helped our universities get started in very basic research centers. And in the case, as you know, Russian studies, Harvard had a large program. In Chinese studies, Harvard, Columbia, University of Washington, Seattle, California, Michigan, all were able to establish fairly large centers. And the United States was a little slow in language training. I think in Eastern Europe and Russia, you probably had better linguistic training than we did. But gradually we improved our language training. And we felt that to understand China, we had to know history, we had to know its society, its economics. And there is still a core of us left, I think, at the universities who think of China studies in those terms. It's a grand approach that includes historians, economists, political scientists, but the people in Washington who call themselves China specialists, they're new breeds. The think tanks developed quite a bit later. And from the point of view of those of us at universities, many of those think tanks have been funded by the national security operation, by the Pentagon, either directly or indirectly, but some foundations. And many of the centers in Washington, from our point of view, are dominated by people who are ambitious academics who would like to be important people in administrations and are not necessarily such good China scholars. Of the names you mentioned, for example, I think that Bill Geertz and Navarro, we would not consider China specialists. They don't have much background. Pillsbury had a background, but frankly, he's not respected by the China community. He's considered somebody who takes shortcuts, and what he says is more motivated by political purposes than by basic scholarship. But so I would say that at the universities, we are still training a lot of scholars who are concerned about the broad historical, economic, political, social developments. But in Washington now, it's come to be dominated by people who carry out think tanks. I would, in a very rough way, divide the Washington community between people who know quite a bit about China and are serious and realize it's important to have good relationships. Another group I would call, this is not a nice word, but opportunists. People who are looking for opportunities to be in important positions in some administration. And those are not necessarily respected so much by the academic community. They're not connected. I think most of us who are in the academic world feel that our problems with China are very severe. We have a lot of work to do, but that we must work with China. And I think that there's some of the people in Washington who now call themselves China specialists, they're less concerned about, really working with China than they are about their own positions in American society. So that's a very quick overview.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Professor Sergei Karaganov, the head of our department, wants to make a comment or ask a question, I can see. Yes. Professor Karaganov, could you switch on your microphone, please? Your microphone is switched off. No, you again switched it off. Now it should be.
Yes, now it works.
All right.
Yeah, it is Professor Vogel. It is a real pleasure and honor to see you here. I remember reading your books also 30, 40 years ago. You were a legend, you are still the legend, you are the best. My question is about the parallel, about the policies which United States pursued in the 80s and the 90s by squeezing Japan down, imposing quotas, imposing change in the currency changes in Japan, and then, as they say, virtually imposing stagnation on Japan. To which extent do you think people in Washington want to repeat the experience they have had in the 80s and the 90s, which, from the point of view of squeezing Japan down and slowing its development, was successful? And whether these policies will be successful this time, if, of course, they're more or less the same as they used to be. Of course, in a different environment, and of course, China is not as dependent on the United States as Japan was.
I remember those days very well. I think many people now forget how tense the relations were toward Japan in the late 80s. They were really very severe because there was worry in the mid 80s as Japan began to produce TV sets and automobiles that were really making a big impact in the American market. We thought of those as Americans, you know, the car producing and TV, that was American industry and semiconductors, and that Japan was in danger of passing us in those very basic things and cutting into our markets. And we were saying many of the things about Japan that we now say about China. They're stealing our technology, you know, we have done all the basic research, and now they're just taking it over. And Japan was growing, very, as you know, very rapidly, and our feelings were very strong. The basic difference, of course, is that at that time we still had a security alliance with Japan. And in the case of China, the security is just the other way around. So with Japan, the competition and the worry was economic. But I remember when Mondale was ambassador in Japan, saying that, look, we got a security alliance, we need to keep working with these people, and we can't let the economic concerns take over. So I think there was a broader basis. I think in the case of China, the situation is much more severe than the competition with Japan was in the 80s. As you know, in the 1989, when the bubble burst in Japan, they really were in trouble. And after that time, after the bubble burst, the United States pushed we pushed the Plaza Accord on them in the mid 80s, which meant reevaluation. And then the Japanese government, I think, made mistakes by trying to encourage the economy too much. They allowed inflation to go too much until the bubble burst in '89. And it took about 2 or 3 years after that before Americans were really convinced that Japan was no longer a threat. In the case of China now, I think, first of all, China is so much larger. They are already having a much larger global impact. And they have a military that is now approaching the American military in scope and size and modernity and big science and technology. And it's clear that the Chinese have much broader ambitions than the Japanese did, which were primarily economic. And the Chinese have people in all fields. The Chinese, as you know, have sent so many people abroad. They're now something like, as of last year, before the coronavirus problem, there were about 350,000 Chinese students in the United States. It's an extraordinary number. My understanding is there were never more than 10,000 Russian students in the United States, as far as I know. But Chinese 35 times that much, and many times the Japanese students. I talked to a Japanese PhD student here in chemistry, and he said, well, he has trouble in laboratories because the other students talk to each other in Chinese and he can't understand it because there are just so many Chinese students now in the scientific fields in the various parts of the United States. So the competition with China now is much broader and includes the military, and the Chinese have been much more ambitious politically. One thing about Japan, it's been so internally oriented, and there's such a unity of Japanese. They find it easier to have the similar views. That in my view, the Japanese are not very good at explaining things to people of different cultural backgrounds. They're so homogeneous. They have a term, ishin denshin. You know, people sort of look at each other and they sort of sense what the other thinks because society is so homogeneous. China is, because they have, you know, Uyghurs and Tibetans and city people, rural people, they have learned to give speeches that convey, they're easier for foreigners to understand. They in a way, it's a more cosmopolitan, international language that they've grown up in that kind of culture. They can explain themselves to people and give speeches in other countries that are sometimes quite persuasive. The Japanese have not acquired that skill in the same way. And I think until now, even though the Japanese were quite ambitious economically in the 80s, they did not have the global political ambitions and interest and ability to explain themselves in a broad range of different kind of environment that the Chinese have. So the bottom line, in my view, is that the Chinese challenge the United States. It's much deeper, it's much broader, and it will continue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Vogel. Now it's Olga Puzanova, a researcher from our laboratory who is studying and teaching on Japan, by the way. Okay, please go ahead.
Where in Japan? Where
hello.
in Japan?
I'm not in Japan.
No, no,
I'm
no.
working on Japan, and I'm teaching history of East Asia as well as Japanese politics and economy at the faculty. So I'm not actually based in Japan.
Did you study in England?
Pardon?
Okay. Did you study in England?
Yeah, yes, I did. Thank you so much for your insightful lecture. I had a short question. I mean, it probably has a long answer, but according to the polls, as we all know, the Japanese do not really view the Chinese very favorably. Does this happen, in your opinion, more so due to historical reasons, or is it the Chinese economic might or competition that is causing this negativity and this friction? Thank you.
I think can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think that the Japanese experience of 1990s, when they had the patriotic campaign, was so anti-Japanese, and they do not feel that the Chinese have given them sufficient credit for all their contributions. The Japanese have perhaps not apologized enough for World War II, and the Chinese have not given sufficient credit for Japanese contributions. Some people put it very briefly. The Japanese have not learned to say, "I'm sorry," and the Chinese have not learned to say, "Thank you." So that bothered them. I think there has been a general feeling among many Chinese that the Japanese were too arrogant, and that I think that the feeling that began to be around 2008, 2010, aha, now we're finally winning and we'll put you in our place. I think that feeling was quite strong in many Chinese, and the Japanese responded to that. And even though the Chinese now have wanted to improve relations with Japan, they still have not stopped sending airplanes to Senkaku Diaridao and ships, and therefore they don't trust China, and they feel that if there is a new problem in China of unifying the country, that they can still turn the switch of anti-Japanese feelings that they have turned down, but they can turn it up again. And so the experience of the 90s means that the Japanese don't feel they can trust the Chinese, but they're quite pragmatic. And because Japan is so close, and a Japanese executive from Tokyo or Osaka can fly to Shanghai or Beijing in the morning early and spend the day and come home in the evening and conduct business. And many of them do. And I think their response to the coronavirus was much better than American. They immediately were sympathetic, and they wanted to send things in to help in Hunan, and they were quite humane and pragmatic about that. Whereas America was driven by the Washington anti-Chinese mood, which is very strong, and so we did not have a human helpful response. And so I think on those things, Japan is quite pragmatic and ready to work with China.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's very interesting actually, because when you were talking about the United States approach, so maybe I ask a question: is it very serious, the anti-Chinese feelings in the United States, or are they only in the government? Because I think it was yesterday or even today that there was this information about the election video of Trump, who said that the prosperity of, basically the prosperity of China is not good for America, it's only good for Biden. Well, if you mean that prosperity of China... yes, it's a prosperity of China. If you proclaim that the prosperity of China is not good for your country, it means that you are an enemy, basically. What do you expect in return then? So is it going to go on forever? What do you think?
Well, as you know, America has been very split the last few years. A lot of us who are academics, as you know, were quite surprised that Trump won in the first place. We didn't realize that the anti-Washington mood, anti-elite mood was so strong as it was. And I think there are a lot of those people who, the anti-elite mood, are not so concerned about China. I think that in Washington now, you have a new situation. If you say who in the past 20, 30 years has supported good relations with China, it has been mainly the business community and the academics. And the academics have wanted to understand China better, have more exchanges, welcome them to our university. And the business people have made a lot of money in China. And sometimes, of course, you have to be realistic in looking at businesses, that many times they were the ones who were investing in Chinese factories and using Chinese labor, which replaced American labor. So it was not just Chinese taking advantage, it was American business people who saw opportunities to make money by having Chinese workers produce things cheaply that they could sell back in the United States. So I think now what's happened as of a year or two ago, that enough business people have joined the criticism of China. As you know, if you were working in the Pentagon and you wanted to have a big budget next year with congressional support, a few years ago, as you know, we would complain about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has some kind of new military equipment. And now if you were in the Pentagon and looking for next year's budget, you talk about the Chinese threat. And so I think it's driving a lot of the efforts of people in the Pentagon to get more support. But I think it's also true that if you're a military person responsible for the American fleet in the Pacific, and particularly the area along the coast of China, that there are now a lot of uncertainties because of increasing Chinese power that worry those people. So I think the anti-Chinese mood is a combination of the Pentagon people who would like, who are really worried about the growing Chinese threat and who want more financial support for doing something, among business people who feel they're now losing out to China and that China doesn't treat them fairly, that is favoring socialist companies and Chinese companies, and that we don't have a system really to look out for American companies the way China has a governmental system to look out for Chinese companies. And I think now the last year or two, of course, the journalists feel that they are not given an opportunity to have open access to Chinese. And now the academics feel they're not given enough opportunity to have research and teaching and open discussions with China. So there are no now strong group that's supporting China. I think the article that Kurt Campbell and other partner wrote saying that the Washington consensus is against China was a little too strong. And he said that the last few years of engagement didn't work. I don't think that is a real consensus among people who know things. And I think even he backed down a little bit. But I think it is true that there is a very wide consensus among political class in Washington now that hitting China is very popular. I think throughout the rest of the country, it's not necessarily true. I mean, the farmers who sold wheat to China were not so anti-Chinese. And a lot of people in the Midwest and the West have no interest in the anti-Chinese mood. So I think the anti-Chinese mood has been much stronger in Washington. My hope is that the next administration can realize that it's still in American interest to work with China, even though our competitor, our rival, that after all, the world is too small and that we have to find ways to work with them in dealing with international disease threats and keeping the economy open and finding rules to make a livable world. Unfortunately, those kind of people, I include myself in that group, are not in the majority and not in power now. My hope is that the next administration will listen to us a little better. Yeah.
Thank you. We have Mr. Marat Galimov from Volgograd State University. Marat, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, yes. Well, Volgograd, by the way, if somebody does know that, is former Stalingrad. It's a great city. And
yes,
it is also important that it shows that we're listened to not only by Moscow people, but from people from other cities of Russia. So Mr. Galimov, and his question is interesting. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All the questions are interesting.
Yes, should I repeat the question I have already written? Or...
Sure, because...
Yes, I didn't hear the question. I did not hear the question.
Okay. How to judge whose economic miracle, Japan's or China's, is more impressive? By which factors, really?
That's a great question. Japan has had a very long history of economic development. Already, as you know, in Manchuria in the 1930s, they were developing a fairly modern industrial sector. And as you know, by the Russians who went into China's northeast after World War II, there was quite a bit of fairly modern industry that had been developed there. Whereas in the case of China, after 1949, except for the Northeast, there wasn't very broad development. And I think the Japanese have step by step after World War II learned when they began in the 1950s to visit American automobile factories. Americans were very pleased to show them around. They were so proud. They had no idea the Japanese could be real competitors. And it was as if they were showing off their great success to some outside curious person. But the Japanese kept learning and gradually developed their technology. So I think the Japanese success has been built up in a steady way ever since the Meiji period. Chinese is what is remarkable is how rapidly it grew after 1978, considering how far behind, and a country of that size could grow that fast so quickly. I think it took a combination between sending students all over the world and having a lot of welcoming a lot of foreign countries, but keeping a political control over all those developments. I think in my view, since 1978, the Chinese, it's even more of a miracle that a place of that size and diversity that was so far behind in so many areas has grown so rapidly. And I think it has to do with sending so many students abroad, by having a meritocracy of officials, by having a lot of foreigners come in and bring in their technology. The Japanese did not bring foreign technology to their country. I mean, they managed to find ways to make it difficult for American firms to develop in Japan in the 1960s and 70s. But in the case of China, they were so far behind and they felt they were big enough to control foreign companies. So they set up joint ventures, and so many foreign companies invested in plants in China. And that, of course, helped China grow rapidly. But in my view, the Chinese ability to grow almost 10% a year for over 40 years in a place of that size, in a country that was that far behind, to me, that's more of a miracle than the Japanese sort of steady development over 100 years.
So,
Thank you.
thank you. Now we have Anna, Anna, because we don't have any other information, who wanted to ask about Chinese behavior. Are you here?
Yes,
You introduce yourself, please, because we don't know anything about you.
Can you see me?
No, just the name.
Just the name. And can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm a student from Perm.
From where?
Perm is a city in the Urals.
Perm, it's Russian, and I'm a student of the High School of Economy. And I would like thank you, Professor, for your lecture. It was very interesting, and I would like to know some information about Chinese consumer behavior in the sphere of aviation. Maybe you know some preferences of some preferences of Chinese air passengers. And if we say about aviation marketing, what marketing instruments can airline companies use in order to attract Chinese consumers?
It's a very specific question.
Maybe Alexander, you can help me understand the question.
Yes, well, it's a very specific question, but I think because you fly to China and Japan quite a lot.
The question?
She's actually asking what can what would be a good strategy for advertising airlines in China for Chinese consumers, for Chinese people to fly airplanes.
What do they wait for flight, for example?
What do you think they like on board, basically?
I think now in China, there is so much on informal communication through the network that if the Japanese companies supplied good service and gave good opportunities to visit Japan, it would not take any special advertising. I think that word gets around in China through the internet very quick. And I think good service, rapid programs in China and Japan, I think would not have any great difficulty. And in the winter, you know, the skiing in Hokkaido is very popular. And many of the other places now are already known. And among Chinese visitors abroad, those who have been to Japan say they want to go again. They really find a kind of familiarity. I think that the long-term cultural relation, when they look at a sign and see signs in Chinese characters, even though it's an abbreviated character, a little different than the Chinese character, is a kind of familiarity, and there's a kind of politeness that the Chinese visitors find quite comfortable. So I think that's why the Chinese visitors the last few years have been quite surprised because with all the anti-Japanese propaganda in the patriotic education campaign, to actually see this culture which seems quite familiar. There is Buddhism, there are temples, there are characters. There is a kind of familiarity and comfort that I don't think requires much advertising. I think that the internet now will make it possible for these things to be known very quickly.
Right. Thank you. We have, I can see 2 more questions and then we'll probably finish. The next one is Professor Koldunova from MGIMO University. Professor Koldunova, are you here with us?
Here, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead, yeah, with your question.
Good evening and good morning to those in the different part of this world. Professor, thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to see you, to hear you. I have your marvelous book about Deng Xiaoping on my bookshelf.
Thank you for buying it.
Yeah, I not only bought it, I took an effort to bring it home. So my question comes from your explanation of ups and downs in relations between China and Japan. And I wonder, does an economically stronger China inevitably mean a more nationalistic China? And this refers not just only to China-Japan relations, but to also China-US relations, not speaking about China-Russia relations, which we should be very much, aware of. So what's your opinion? Will we see the further rise of nationalistic thinking in China? Thank you.
In my view, nationalism has been there for quite a while. That I would say that ever since the May 4th movement, when they had trouble at the Treaty of Versailles, nationalism became really very strong. And I think Russians have experienced Chinese nationalism in 1960 also. So I don't think it's a new thing. What I think is new is the Chinese confidence. I think there is a growing confidence now that they can have a much bigger impact. They didn't think that the World Bank was doing enough to welcome Chinese, and so they were ready to form their own AIIB, their own bank, and the scale of Chinese investment. I was in Beijing when they invited something like 45 leaders of African countries to Beijing. The scale with which a country that size and now that wealth can begin to behave, I think allows them to behave in a much stronger way. I felt that in Deng Xiaoping, he had an expression, Ta Guang Yang Hui, which meant, that we wouldn't rush into things too much. We would wait. But I think that now you have a combination between some administrators who realize they have to make some accommodation around the world, and some who now are feeling very confident. And I think we don't know the answer yet. My own interpretation is that ever since my friend Tim Brooke is a very good historian at the University of British Columbia, he uses the Chinese term Dagua, the great state, which already started the Mongols, that they would expand around the world. But I think that as they expand around the world, where they have met opposition, they adjust. And my own hunch is that they will adjust to the realities of the environment that they can find themselves in. And that if the United States and Europe and Japan and other countries remain strong and do a good job of things, I think the Chinese will adjust to that. But in my view now, since 2008 with the financial crisis, and since the Trump era, they feel the United States is much weaker now than it was, and they have a lot of opportunities to expand. So I would say they've not increased in nationalism, but they have increased in confidence.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, now when I said that we have 2 questions, some people wrote more, so now we have 3. Well, Professor Vogel, if you are tired, you can finish any.
I'm not tired.
Yes,
a good question.
You could answer 3 more questions, and then
Sure.
then we'll stop. And we won't accept any new questions. So now is Vladimir Malyavin, a professor at our university, a research professor who worked for a very long time in Taiwan. So,
okay.
Professor Malyavin, are you here? Hello.
Yes, I'm here, thanks.
Yes, please, your question.
Thank you. Professor Vogel, first let me thank you for this brilliant opportunity to hear you and see you at the same time. It's a great day for me. My question is, I've written it down, but I think I should say it out loud. Does it still make sense to view China-Japan relations as a contest for being recognized or having a label of the Middle Kingdom that possesses ritual authority? And if yes, what can be done about that? Can it be somehow solved if there is such a rivalry? Thank you.
In my, the many people in Washington like to talk in very big terms about China. For 5,000 years, they've had such a culture. But I think many of us who work on China in the United States find that many changes and many competing views, and that there is no simple way of interpreting China. We find I got to know many of the dissidents who came from China, and many of the intellectuals who were quite open-minded. And I also came to know some, when I worked in Guangdong, I could see some party officials who were quite narrow-minded and were not, then there were opportunists. There are many different people and many different views. I don't think the idea as a ritual leader is as strong as some people would like to make it. I think that, you know, most of us who really spend a lot of time getting into the differences of different kinds of Chinese people, different kinds of thinking, don't have an explanation like that it wants to be the ritual power. But I think that the general idea is they want China to be strong in many different ways. I don't believe they feel that Chinese culture historically is something that they're trying to put up around the world. I think they want to do propaganda, and I think they're finding that some of the simple propaganda doesn't work very well. I think they're going to have to do a lot of adaptation. When I see a lot of Chinese correspondents in Washington come to see me and interview me, my own impression is that many of these people are more open-minded than their country is, that they would like me to be a voice for saying that China should be more open and that there are opportunities to have more open discussions, and that it would not stick to its own old culture, but be a participant in international activities. So my answer, I guess, is I don't see China setting itself up to be a ritual model in the old pattern. I do think they use some symbols from the past, but that if you examine the symbols, they don't go very deep, that the world has changed so much that the actual way they are behaving really have more to do with the current situation than they do to the culture of the past.
Well, thank you. Now we have Dmitry Vinnik from High School of Economics, professor of our university. Professor Vinnik, hello.
Hello, hello.
Yes, please go ahead with your question.
My question is, Professor, did you find some kind of Japan jealousy against China in concern to Russian-China economical development and cooperation? So, as far as I understand, Japan in the future will have some of deficit of natural resources. That's why the cooperation and ability to have access to Siberian natural resources is quite significant, sufficient for them. Is in Japan academical community is some kind of discussion in concern to this question?
I'm not a specialist on the issue of national resources. I know that the Japanese feel very dependent on natural resources, and of course, they think about Russian natural resources in the Middle East. They have seen the new advances in America in shale technology and Canada also. I think the Japanese are quite adaptable. I think that, you know, at one time they were concerned, they want to keep open, of course, all possibilities. And they were at one time more focused on the Middle East, but as the world situation changes, which countries have the best resources and where are the best prices. And for Japan, it's a question of long-term security. They're not concerned only about present prices, but because they have so few natural resources, so few petroleum, they're completely dependent on the world. And the experience of beginning of World War II, when the United States began to cut off some supplies from Indonesia and Southeast Asia, was so overwhelming that they are very concerned about the security of long-term supplies. But I think that they are not fixated. If you look at the changes over the last several decades, they've adapted to the international situation, but they have very good specialists who do look to the energy security.
Right. So we have the last question from Sergei Radchenko, who is a Russian historian on East Asia and works in not England, in Wales, actually, in Britain. Sergei, are you here? Hello?
On mute. Okay, I think. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
It's nice weather you have there in Wales.
It is very nice out here in the UK. Thanks very much. I mean, first of all, thanks for a wonderful presentation. And Alexander, also thanks for organizing this, a wonderful opportunity to see people who you normally get to see once every 4 or 5 months in one chat room. I have the following question. Recently, the Russians have declassified documents on Kissinger. On the 1970s, and as you would expect, Kissinger that comes through in those documents, and primarily we're talking about records of conversations with varying, Russian diplomats, etc., is very different from the Kissinger that appears in his book on China or in many of his other books. Here's what he says about China. He says China, and that's, we're talking about the sort of mid-1970s towards the late 1970s, so he's shifting out of power. In fact, some of those conversations took place after he left the office of the Secretary of State in the Ford administration. He says basically, he says to the Russians, don't worry, look, we have been improving relations with China, but in fact, this is just a temporary thing, because for the future, we're actually really worried about China. They will join forces with Japan, and they will together represent a gigantic menace to the Western civilization. And this is Kissinger, yeah? Now, he says, okay, that will take maybe 20, 25 years. And when this happens, us and the Russians will come together to combat this, yellow peril, or what you may call it. Anyway, so when I was reading that, I found it extremely interesting. But it does give rise to the following question. Do you think that because of the shifts in international politics, eventually the United States and Russia will find some common ground in opposition to China, or should they even?
First of all, about Kissinger, I personally know Kissinger and have talked to him about some of these issues. And I think he never felt very comfortable with Japan because he didn't find the kind of broad gauge thinking. I think he really enjoyed Zhou Enlai because he was a broad gauge strategic person, and that Japan didn't have those strategic thinkers who talked about global issues in the same way. So I think he felt there was kind of a grandeur to some of the Chinese thinking, particularly Zhou Enlai, but others who followed in that tradition. And the question of whether the United States and Russia will cooperate against China and Japan, my own reading is that China and Japan will not become that close. I think that there is an effort to build comfort. But if you were Japanese and you'd seen how Chinese troops were coming nearby your shores, and you thought about their increase of their power and the nationalist kind of expressions that come from China and ambitions, I think they would be quite cautious. So I don't see the prospects of a close Chinese and Japanese alliance. I don't know enough about the opportunities for the United States and Russia to cooperate on big issues. I do think that there is a possibility that a new administration in the United States will again develop a better foreign policy than we've had the last few years. I think the idea of American first and the unwillingness to consider the importance of international relations with other countries that we've had during the Trump administration has really hurt our country very much. And I think those of us intellectuals hope that a future administration, we can't get rid of all the doubts that other countries have toward us as a result of this mood we've had the last few years of America First. But I hope that America can resume some of the better role that we had of having stronger international relations and a stronger sense of responsibility for the fate of the world than we've had the last few years. And I think I'm not unique among academics. I think there may be a Harvard professor who likes Trump, but I personally have not met any of those people. And I think that we have very high hopes that there will be a better administration after January. Thank you very much. Alex, are we through?
Thank you very much. This was the last question. We had a lot of people listening to you and a great talk. It's more than, well, it's about 70 people from about dozen countries, many Russian regions. So thank you very much for your time, and
we will pay you back by having you lecture for us.
well, that's not the same level, unfortunately. So I'll have to speak 10 times for one in exchange of one yoto.
No, don't be so modest. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are going to finish here. Thank you, Professor Vogel.
My pleasure, and I hope to keep further contacts with the people in Russia. Thank you very much, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.